Hello and welcome to Bergcast, a podcast celebrating the work of visionary writer Nigel Kneale. In this special episode, we chat to Mark Gatiss, who like Kneale has had a huge impact on popular culture. Mark talks about Kneale's sweaty terror and cosy pessimism, his attempts to get new Kneale productions made and greater industry recognition, their respective adaptations of The First Men in the Moon, and Mark also shares his memories from the unique experience of making the 2005 live Quatermass Experiment.
You first became aware, not necessarily of just Quatermass, of Nigel Kneale. Was it through the gateway drug of Doctor Who, or was it separate?
I guess it's hard, isn't it, from this distance? I have a very, very particular memory of watching the movie of Quatermass in the Pit on a Tuesday night on the BBC, and then everyone at school talking about it in the dinner queue the next day. I can see that now. And I'm sure through that, in that sort of osmotic way, you then obviously talk to your parents and go, oh, yes, I remember pubs emptying. All the anecdotes came out. And that must have been, I can pretty much date that because it was Junior 3. That must have been about 1975, 76. And then, of course, what that joins in perfectly with is Beasts. And so Beasts, I was really obsessed with. And so I think I kind of knew about the whole shebang around then. And I also saw the movies of Experiment and Quatermass 2 on BBC 2. So it's a sort of, it's a combination of parental anecdote, how frightening they were, how frightening I found them myself, particularly Quatermass 2 on the telly, and then Beasts obviously having this profound effect on me. And then really just a slight huffety-puffety to Quatermass conclusion, because then everything came together and I bought all the scripts and I was able to consume the whole thing. So it's basically a mid to late 70s encounter.
Were you aware then that Beasts was written by the guy who'd done The Hammer Pit? Yeah.
By the Quatermass man. I remember, I think it was certainly in the paper, not the Radio Times, I don't know, because we only got it at Christmas.
We did too.
And it was ITV anyway.
Terrible admission. I think in that way that you can judge people, you can sometimes meet someone and go, oh yes, you weren't allowed to watch ITV, were you? And I'm always terribly jealous of people who got the Radio and TV Times all year round. I mean, it was even more of a treat for us. It was such an indulgence. But anyway, I remember reading the Northern Echo that it was by the Quatermass man, the Rocket Man. And so that was certainly led me to watch Beasts. And then I just remember being in our region in Tyne Tees, during Barty's Party was the first one. Still one of my favourites. And although I stuck to them religiously, that and Baby were the ones that made the most profound effect. But I just remember being so, I remember feeling a bit like I do today. It was a sort of sweaty terror, which you just didn't really get on the telly. And I suppose, with adult eyes, I look back and I think, Barty's Party is such a brilliant idea. If you listen to Classic FM, as I do, you realise that the principle of Barty's Party has not gone away, and this sort of endless repetition of commercial adverts and a sort of chatty, homely Radio 2 quality. But you couple that with this idea about super rats that you never see, and then this brilliant inversion of the power balance between Elizabeth Sellers, who is the sort of definition of a repressed 70s housewife, and her husband being one of those tie-loosening, whiskey-drinking husbands. And then by the end, she's in charge and he's a wreck. And you still never see the rats. It's a marvellous piece of work, I think. So, I loved his voice, I suppose, and his kind of it's a weird sort of cozy cynicism, or perhaps a kind of, there's a strange pessimism to Kneale, I've always thought, and yet he loves people. He loves people. He loves tradition, but he's afraid of it, or he's afraid of it in the wrong hands. And he really has such a special voice. It really isn't like anybody else. there's a celebration of tradition, and there's also a terror of it.
There's I'm reminded, actually, obviously he's affected your own work quite profoundly. I remember quite early on, you had that wonderful scene with Mr. Chiddery, who has a direct Nigel Kneale reference where he's dissecting the sewn together animals in that episode. That's just, I remember I saw it quite late, but I remember just screaming out loud when you just said, "It's a beast."
Oh, yeah. it's full of them. It's full of them. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's always profoundly affected. It's about, it's not just, you know, the themes and the, you know, similarity of things that are very close to my heart. It's also, it's just his incredibly admirable skill as a former actor. He had a great ear for dialogue and a brilliant eye for character. I mean, really, the way he sketches in these little cameos and things. And there's a wonderful bit, back to Beast, there's a wonderful bit in What Big Eyes. What an extraordinary piece of work that is. When the Michael Kitchen's boss is it's essentially giving him all the exposition about Patrick McGee's weird pet shop, but he's doing it whilst on the phone and getting someone to talk their cat down. It's very clever, because you get the whole lot, which is very outre. But in the meantime, he's just saying, "Well, try a sauce with milk." It's very nicely done.
I mean, as far back as Pitt, the BBC Pitt, you know, you get, you know, far back as Experiment, you get the narrative device used equally as well by Russell Davies and the Doctor Who, of just a news dump, as newscasting as info dump. Yeah. And I think it's a great shame that although the most, I think, remembered list of Quatermass now are the films, just because when they're seen. You miss the little asides of, you know, the great British public. Those scenes in Half Men, first episode of Pitt, when the increasingly horrified middle class BBC interviewer is in an almost Chris Morris would do this brilliantly with a bit of speak your brains. It's like basically you're giving them an insensible question, like, do you think they should? Yeah, why not? If they want to, what's wrong with that? And like, and oh God, thank God, here's someone whose opinion really matters. And then we can go on to the utter snobbishness of both subverting the British public being thick and why should we ask them, to the utter snobbishness of being judged in that way.
Yes, he does that very brilliantly, because he doesn't take sides in the way you might expect him to. But the weird thing for me about that is that I finally saw the TV Pitt when it was released on video. And of course, all that stuff's edited out. Yeah. And it wasn't until the DVD, I think, that I saw those bits, which I adore those. And I always, I mean, in the old times, BC, before COVID, when all we talked about was Brexit, and I used to yell at the telly every day, "Don't talk to people, stop talking to people." And what was constantly in my mind, it was that, you know, it's so similar. When they're going up and down the line and saying, "Well, I like 8 Men. I think they're a good thing. I think we should have more of them."
Which is, and the resolution, or the attempted resolution of Pitt is almost pure Brexit. The Colonel.
The Wild Hunt. I was invoking it only the other day. The Wild Hunt. It's such a potent idea, and he is absolute genius in roping together all these incredibly diverse seeming concepts into not just into a brilliant story, but just a sort of myth that you completely fall for, because you just go, that's entirely plausible. And when he invokes, you know, the spirit of Notting Hill, what he was living through at the time, the idea of the race riots might actually have a sort of primal urge to kill and destroy the other. It's entirely plausible, isn't it?
The desperation also of the minister to be told by Breen, that's rubbish, it's clearly this, and that's far more simple, even though the simple doesn't really make sense. Oh, okay, I'll cling on to that because the awkward consequences of having to believe Quatermass. So I'll just believe the Germans put aliens in a spaceship to fool us. Why has it been buried that deep? It doesn't make sense. But no, I'll take it. It has that dark Wagnerian quality of the heart. It's just, but then, you're sort of, I mean, and I was initially talked about when we did Pitt, well, that's only, 15 years, less less than 15 years after the war. But the truth is, we're still banging on about the war in all the wrong ways now.
Oh yeah,
it's still in.
I think one of my sad stories about Nigel Kneale is 2001. We tried to get The Road remade. When I met him, I also had a meeting at the 6th floor of the BBC about trying to get them to do a new Nigel Kneale script. I just said, I think the man who looks around corners, I'd love to know what Nigel Kneale thinks the next 20 or 30 years are going to be like. Sadly, their response was that anyone who predated the age of the remote control was effectively not on the list. Oh. But to imagine what he would have made of now, and if he were alive today, what he would be thinking was next. Maybe he would. Maybe he'd actually become more optimistic because he'd seen it all before. I mean, it's terribly familiar, all this, isn't it? But the way we have commodified and fetishized the World War II into a creation myth. We've got the World Cup and World War II. That's it. It's all we cling on to it like a shroud.
2 world wars and 1 World Cup.
Hey, got Bucks Fizz.
Yeah.
And Bucks Fizz.
Remember, they're Brexiters, you see, so they're sort of part of that.
Are they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a Brexit ballad on their last album.
I'm crushed.
Yeah. Oh no, I think Cheryl was vocal about pro-Brexit views on Twitter. Also, adding to this as well, there's something so concertedly very heterosexual about war and football in the way there isn't for Eurovision. So possibly that doesn't feed into the.
We have also won subsequently, just to be kind.
Right. Yes.
Yes, indeed.
With an Australian singer, but anyway, let's not about that. So when. After your rise to fame, when did you think you would have got into a position that you would like to try and either adapt Nigel Kneale or work with Nigel Kneale?
Well, I mean, I straight as soon as I could is the answer. I mean, as soon as the League of Gentlemen took off, I was trying. I mean, apart from putting lots of references into it, I wrote to someone at BAFTA trying to get him a lifetime BAFTA, and I got a very warm response, but then nothing seemed to come of it. And I'm not quite sure how The Road came about. Well, I did the very first BBC4 drama, which was called Surrealissimo, about Salvador Dali.
Yes, I remember that.
And I got to know they were called the Fiction Unit, which is rather.
Oh yes, did that become Fiction Lab later?
Fiction Lab, that's right, Fiction Lab. Yeah, very needless. And Richard Curzon Smith, who directed it, and a guy called Jess Cleverly. And I think he must have been talking about it. That's how it came about. That's how the idea came about. And I remember taking my now lost copy of the 3 Kneale scripts, that were privately printed into the BBC to talk about doing The Road. Maybe it was my idea. I actually can't remember now. But I'd read that, you see, when I bought that sometime in the early 80s in a junk shop, and that was the one of all of them, actually, even more than Sex Olympics, that I just thought, this is must. I mean, it's a ghost story. They're my favorite things, but I thought, it made my hair, which I had then, made my hair stand on end. The idea of a reverse haunting, a haunting from the future, is just such a brilliant idea. So I tried very, very early on, yeah. And then as a result, happily spent the day in Barnes with him and Judith. And I asked him everything I needed to know because I didn't think I'd get another opportunity, and I didn't. So I was glad. I asked him whether if Quatermass 4 had happened when it was originally planned, whether they would have got Andre Morel back. I asked him about The Woman in Black. I asked him about First Man in the Moon. It was just amazing. I got the lot. Some very funny things. And of course, he very casually said, I did write another Quatermass. I don't know if I wrote it down anywhere. I didn't remember going, what? But we all know about that one.
Indeed, yeah.
Yes.
I was very actually just before lockdown started in that BC when they finally announced the Blu-ray of Nigel Kneale's Woman in Black. It's you and Kim Newman doing the commentaries.
Yes, we've just done it. I mean, it was a joyous. It looks incredible. It looks better than it ever did. My old VHS for happy years always. It was very soft, wasn't it, on the telly? It's beautiful, it's pin sharp, and it's still absolutely fantastic.
Yes, I'm very, very excited about it.
It's one of the most frightening pieces of television I've ever seen.
And it's far more scary than Susan Hill's novella. It's well, in my opinion.
She has a strange relationship. She didn't like it. She didn't like it.
I heard that.
But it's also it's done in flashback, isn't it? It starts with a Christmas story, and the guy then writes down his Christmas story. So it's bookended immediately.
But it really follows the beats of the story very closely, and it's just so well made. I mean, amazing cast. But as you say, the scares. I think the following two Christmases, 1991, I used to take that black box video with me and like an evangelist and play it wherever I could. And every time, I remember the following Christmas 1990, I was staying in Rhys Shearsmith's flat in Wood Green and we watched it. And when it got to the bit, he screamed more than the woman in black. And that is still the most welcome ad break of all time.
Yeah.
Oh my God, yeah.
It's masterfully done. It really is. It's just, and she just doesn't stop.
No.
She just doesn't stop coming.
It goes on and on.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's incredible, but it's he makes some. He changes the guy's main name, Kipps to Kiss,
yes.
Doesn't he? Yes.
It's a strange thing. This is an interesting thing. We talked about this the other day. I mean, whether that's what Susan Hill objected to, but it's in a way because it's H.G. Wells' character from Kipps. It became half a sixpence. It could actually be the same person. And weirdly, Neil really, really venerated Wells. And not surprisingly, I think, because I think they are comparable in terms of their gifts and they're also their visionary status, you know. And in a way, the way that Wells invented so much of what we know as all the staples of science fiction, and so did Neil in a different context, you know. But I think he somehow found it a bit rude that she'd used this name from Wells, so he made it into Kid instead of Kipps. But he told me he wrote it in 10 days, and as a job, really. I mean, he had a great affinity for ghost stories, and he liked it, I think. And he had this marvelous late blooming relationship with Central TV. He wrote it in 10 days, and his agent said, "Oh, don't send it in yet; they'll think you've rushed it." So he sat on it. He just sat on it for weeks and weeks, and it nearly didn't happen because they thought, "Oh, he's too old; he can't do it." And at the last minute, I think Herbert Wise rang up and said, "How's it going?" He said, "I finished it 4 weeks ago." I went, "Oh my God, send it, please." That's how it happened. Yeah, thank goodness.
You remember watching Wise and Neil's other great collaboration, Ladies' Night?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was.
I mean, I remember as a Neil obsessive, I remember, just seeing his name pop up in these contexts was fascinating. I mean, I always found his non-genre work fascinating simply because, as Alan Bennett says, that we all only have a few beans in our tin to rattle. And the way that his preoccupations and his obsessions just keep forcing themselves into stuff is really interesting. I mean, his last TV is Cavanagh, isn't it? Or is it Sharp? But
I think it's Cavanagh, yeah.
Yeah, and it's called, what's it called? Ancient History.
Yeah, it's the Holocaust guy, yeah.
It's still about the ghost of the past, isn't it? So even in a straight drama, there's something about those preoccupations which he simply can't get away from, which is fascinating.
I think the Ladies' Night one, the Unnatural Causes, is the funniest he's ever been, because I think you have that Fiona Shaw's character where you just have the audience member going, "What's he doing? Why?" When you have is it Alfred Burke's big speech about saving Hitler's life, or she's commented on it, and the way that when they think they've killed her, everyone just starts drinking scotch, and it's just like, look how useless these are, and it's is similar to the power reversal, I think, in Beast, but it's almost like it's played for laughs. It's in difference to be utterly ridiculous, and then the final insult, the police turn up and all the police are women, and it's
interesting because Kinvig, which I remember very well. It's the same time. There was so much Nigel Kneale in the late 70s, and I remember I so wanted to love it, and it's just utterly bizarre. Well, it's terrible. It's terrible. It's terrible, and.
Which is why I deliberately said Ladies' Night wasn't the funniest thing he's written, because I don't think Kinvig is.
It is so strange. It's such a strange commission, and I think sometimes to be I'll be critical, but although I think he was a genius, that there were some things he wasn't right for, and whether he thought that traditional situation comedy or something was not worthy of attention, but it's first and foremost, it would be fine if it was funny, but it isn't. It's just weird. It's very weird.
Did famously your favourite hero of Doctor Who is John Pertwee, would be fair to say as well. Is there a part of you that, having when you familiarise yourself, particularly with Quatermass 2, you wince a bit when watching season 7 of Doctor Who?
Well, that's another, because as you say, another way of encountering Nigel Kneale early was to know that he was the person who hated Doctor Who, and then you realise later on he probably hated it because they just ripped off everything he ever did. I mean, the Demons, which I have profound memories of. I mean, we're talking about the scariest things. I was 5, and I thought Doctor Who had become real because of the BBC 3 transmission, and I thought it would become real.
It was a big ghost watch.
Wow.
Yeah, I remember Bok coming over the hill. I'd never been so frightened in my life. And then you watch it, of course, when the Doctor has the slides of the horned beast, and just go, So I have this terrible idea that Nigel Kneale managed to miss all of Doctor Who in the 60s, and then he turned on the telly one day and he's like, oh, he just happened to see the Demons. But the influence is profound. The influence was profound. The not much commented on fact about UNIT and the Web of Fear is because of the Pitt film being made in 1967, isn't it? I mean, Mervyn Haseman and Henry Lincoln saw Quatermass and the Pitt at the pictures, and then they wrote Web of Fear. Absolutely. It's set on the tube. It's got everything. The Brigadier, Colonel Bree. It's got a lot. It starts there.
Yeah.
And then obviously Quatermass 2 and the meteorites. But it's just, I mean, the thing is, as a Doctor Who fan, we don't much comment on the magpie nature of the production over the years. And Robert Holmes gleefully stole from all his favourite sci-fi and horror films. And that's why those things are so good. He had a real gift for not just copying, but transmuting it into its own thing. The great thing is, of course, Pyramids of Mars is like a universal mummy film, but it's the Doctor Who version of that. They don't go to Egypt, and there isn't a mummy in that sense. It's still this weird confection of Doctor Who-y things, and I suppose in a similar way with the swarm of guided meteorites. Of course, it's Quatermass 2 and all those things, but actually what the aliens are is very Doctor Who. It's very different. Affinity with plastic, and it has got its own thing, as well as borrowing from Kneale.
As well as Web of Fear, I suppose, Mervyn Haseman and Henry Lincoln could also be influenced by The Abominable Snowman or The Creature, which
yes. Oh God, very much.
Yeah.
I mean, when I first saw the film, you kind of go, oh yeah, here it is.
It's Wolf Morris.
Yeah, I'm sure, absolutely, yes. They went to the pictures a lot, I think. Yeah. Although I don't know what they saw to make the Dominators. Something very boring.
When you came to do First Man in the Moon for Visible, did you ever use Kneale's film script as a starting point? Or was the question of budget meaning that you went off in?
No, I mean, it came about in a curious way that I'd done Crooked House the year before. It was just a portmanteau ghost story, and it was actually it was one of the, I think it was the then controlled BBC 4, Richard Klein, who said, what about H.G. Wells? And the only title that was available was First Man in the Moon. And I did have qualms because I love the movie. I love it, particularly Lionel Jeffries.
Yeah, so good.
But obviously, it felt like an opportunity, even on a tiny budget, really, to do a different version. I suppose that's what. So I read the book, and it's a lovely film, obviously, but it's a curious thing. The Selenites are lovely, but of course they're also kiddies in costumes. The moon calf is gorgeous, but because of the lunar quality, it's kind of colourless, isn't it? It doesn't have the colour of Sinbad or anything like that. So it's a curiosity, and the ending is utterly bizarre. I've always found it so bizarre. And Edward Judd says, "Poor Cavour, he did have such a terrible cold," and you go, "No, he didn't." So I came up with this. There isn't an ending in the book; it just peters out. And I thought, well, if I'm speculating that maybe in 1909 there was an atmosphere, now there isn't. There's a reason it's gone. I thought, well, that's the obvious thing is that Cavorite destroyed it. It was a lovely, lovely experience, and I was essentially playing. I think since I saw that film, I wanted to be Lionel Jeffries in First Man in the Moon, or anyone in a linen suit going, "It's a Tyrannosaurus Rex."
I think so many of these things are possible largely because of things like BBC4. I mean, particularly in its first 10 years, there seemed to be a hugely fun experimental. Let's get it done. We've got small budgets, but hey, we'll see what we can do. Because now there seems to be very little original drama.
Yes, I mean it was officially stopped after the Burton and Taylor thing. That was the last big one, and it's crept back. I mean, my ghost stories are for 4, but it's the strict proviso that it's really very little money. But I don't want to not have them. I mean, it offends me that if there isn't one. We've managed to have one last couple of years, and I really want it to keep going because it's, I wish we had a 10-day shoot and a bigger budget, but I'd rather try and make it. Except I don't want to be too pejorative about it, because the other thing is you sort of make it under 1970s conditions. You're largely left alone, and you have to use your wit in a rather lovely way, I think, just in terms of cast, location, and how to do it. How to create the scares in a small time frame and with very little resource. But it can be a great whetstone to the imagination as well.
Have you got a wish list of M.R. James stories that you'd like to adapt?
Well, it's hard because, again, have you read Kneale's intro to that book of M.R. James's stories?
Yes, yeah. I was going to bring that up. Surely you have that. That's 2 of your great smack coming together.
Given that as a present, it's a very interesting intro, isn't it? Because I think he gets deep into Monty's psychology, and says something like, "Sometimes it must have been very difficult to be M.R. James." I rather like that. When I made the track tape Midith, I remember doing the talk at the BFI and saying I'd love to do other writers. Obviously James is the master, but there are loads and loads of wonderful stories. The trouble is, of course, he really does sell tickets. So when I did the Dead Room a couple of years ago, and that literally was, can you do it for this much? Can you do one for this much? And I said yes, and I wrote the entire thing tailored to that much money. So I wanted to do an original, but also what I do is essentially dramatize M.R. James's rules. So it's sort of a James adaptation, And then Martin's Close last year, and this year we shall see, depending on lockdown. But it's a natural place to go because he's so great, and also because if you put M.R. James' ghost story in the Radio Times, people perk up in a way they don't if it just says Algernon Blackwood, I suppose, or something like that. It would be lovely to. Well, Benson's my other fave. It would be lovely to expand the remit, but it's hard. But I mean, that's not. Again, I'm. Well, but to answer your question, Count Magnus is the biggie, but it remains as it did for Lawrence and Clark. It's expensive, and I think you do. I mean, there's a way you could relocate it to Gloucester Cathedral or something, but there's something brilliant about that Swedish system,
and also how it follows him back in the way that you can do Number 13. You don't have to set that in Jutland or wherever. You can move that quite easily. There's something the way it pursues him, and he returns home.
I think there's also,
say.
when I was in Stockholm a couple of years ago on holiday, and I deliberately went to a lot of kind of rather strange Calvinist-looking churches, and I mean the whole flavour of them is very distinctive. It's not like Barchester, you know. They're really weird. You completely expect, most tombs seem to have a sort of skeleton on them rising. They're very weird. I think it would give it a really special flavour.
Yeah, you have to have the travelogue.
I suppose the fact that there's an easier sell for it's an M.R. James story than it would be for Blackwood or Benson. I mean, that's as much a 70s thing as anything else, isn't it? That's, you know, there's still people, even if they don't remember from the first time around, the concept of the 70s ghost story was M.R. James. So that's part, I think, still of the weird TV ephemera of the 70s. The fact that these are films that are 40 minutes long. There's something still special and unique. There isn't if there's a series. That's why I like anthologies as well. There's something I know people don't make up, even in something like Inside Number 9, still is made and stars the same people. It has a regular cast, but there's something delicious about we're going all out in this direction for this week, but this week only, and then we'll dump it next week. They'll be the theme. Shadows of Fear is still it's I find it. You've got the weird music, you've got your and you don't know what's coming this week. Could be,
and it's the history is essentially television history is replete with rules which are then broken. And I remember being in so many meetings where people they said nobody wants anthologies. You need a precinct. They want to follow the same characters, and then suddenly they don't again, and then that's the new norm. So that's where we are really. And I remember when Black Mirror started, I texted Charlie Brooker and said, "Whisper it, but you just reinvented the dystopian sci-fi play, because apart from the title, it was different." And you could so imagine that being a 60s anthology series on ITV, couldn't you, Black Mirror? That Nigel Kneale would probably have written 2 of.
Yeah. So when you did the Quatermass Experiment, when you did the live story, I heard that initially you were up for Andy Dillittle as well, the chemist, but you said you wanted something a bit more because this is your one chance to do a Quatermass. Is that right? Or
I blackmailed. Basically said I'll do it if I can play a big part.
Were you asked to be involved, or did you just go, this is going on, you have to involve me?
I wish I could. This is terrible, isn't it? Because I sound like one of those reluctant convention guests. I just can't remember. I'd have to dig something out to find out, but it was the same people. It was Fiction Lab and that it was all that area. So I must have heard something and then said, I've got to do it. I've got to be in it. They work quite closely with Nigel Kneale on it. And
I heard they did at the beginning, and then after a while, it was just, it naturally ran out. I don't know when they necessarily consulted him until a certain point. But what I heard from, Andy Murray, Nigel Kneale's biographer, when he was interviewed about it. Now, this is from Nigel, so it's our point of view. But he said they spoke to him quite a lot, and then after a certain level of time, he never heard back. Now, that could just be because there's no more to say on the script development side, or what.
Well, it's more likely that he followed the pattern of his later years, which was sort of, he became rather curmudgeonly, but he was very ill. I talked to Judith Carr quite a lot when I did that Radio Times interview with her, and he, all that stuff about his photosensitivity and it's almost too good for a biographer, isn't it? That he actually, he was sort of couldn't bear the sunshine and had to live in the shadows. And towards the end of his life, he was really very ill, and I think there was a vascular thing going on which made him very short-tempered and all. So there was a pattern. Essentially, apart from Central TV, he got quite short with people, even if, and sometimes especially if they really loved his stuff. And I remember talking to Andrew Pixley about. Andrew knew him quite well. He did. I mean, from like the 80s, he interviewed him, and
He said he singled you out for praise, by the way, when he saw it.
I know, that's nice, isn't it? I mean, I'll take that. Thank you very much. Yeah, that was very kind. I mean, it was an extraordinary experience. I've probably talked about this somewhere else a lot, but it was an extraordinary experience. Not just to feel you were doing Quatermass Experiment, but just to do it live and to join, however briefly. I mean, I have already worked with a lot of elderly actors who were in that club, and no one ever expected to be able to join it again, but you actually could and just go, yeah, don't want to do that again.
Also, John Patterson's a genuinely interesting role, and I was saying this to Howard before we start. More than any other character, he has a journey.
Yes.
In the original, he's got a bit more room to breathe because we've got 3 hours worth of telly. But you've still, he's an interesting character. There is development, there's mistakes, there's virtue, and it must be. I mean, beyond reading the script, you've only got the first 2 episodes. Was it a question of just you need to see? Is it Hugh Kelly in the original? It was just reading the script and finding what you wanted to do with the character from that, or given that it's live, and you just basically, this is heightened tension. We've got to get this out.
All fueled by terror.
Yeah.
Well, it was. I mean, obviously, it's very much of its time. I remember distinctly that that sort of lapel grabbing. What's happened to them? Kind of hysteria of that bit in the capsule. But I think we talked. I said, well, I might doing Northern, and I remember the things I remember best are once I was playing him and not the chemist. The Kenneth Cranham was they were going to ask Kenneth Cranham to be Quatermass, and then there was a very sudden shift to Jason, and I think it was just a decision not to make it feel, Ken would be a brilliant Quatermass, and therefore maybe that was the wrong thing to do because he feels like an obvious choice, whereas Jason being that much younger, it was a totally different way of doing it. I remember that discussion, and then just the logistics of it, and also, we rehearsed it like a play for about a fortnight in a church, in the American church in Tottenham Court Road, and
like 60s Doctor Who, with church.
But we all said from the very beginning, this is too short, and the only thing that's going to happen is it's going to get shorter, because once we start panicking, and indeed we did, so it's a curious piece. I remember watching it the next day at my house here with David Tennant, and we watched it, and those strange lingering sort of drone shots of London just going for ages.
It's too long.
But it was an incredible thrill. It really was an incredible thrill.
I remember watching it back fairly recently before doing this, and one of the things I've never noticed, the bit where David Tennant stumbles, is his arms out running, which I got so used to as a Doctor Who thing. There's almost a Doctor Who performance. And then there was
the beginning.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't stop me if I've said this somewhere else, but apart from poor Adrian Bauer's drying, which was unbelievable, excruciating.
Yeah.
To
and
watch
he was gutted, I hear.
I mean, and also I remember there was they wanted to put it out on the DVD like that. And he went, no, no. But there was a hilarious bit. It was the chemist shop actually. After Andy de la Tour's been there, and essentially the chemist shop was just represented by that rack of test tubes and stuff. Yeah. And Adrian Dunbar finally loses patience and says, "Oh, come on, Quatermass, this little green man is ridiculous." And he slammed the door, and the entire wall of test tubes collapsed. And it cut. I think I remember. As I remember it, it cuts just. It's on David and Jason, and it cuts just as they go. Like just creeping up in the side of their mouths.
I'm gonna have to watch that again.
We were in the green. I was in the green room with Ida Blair and whoever else was by then, and we just heard this unbelievable smashing of glass. We had no idea what was going on, but live telly.
I mean, I know what the reason given for why they chose to do this live. Do you think that reason was justified, or would you just like to have done a remake of it and done it as best you possibly could, or was it a worthwhile experiment? No pun intended.
I think it was. I mean, it was an exercise in how to do it, wasn't it? And I suppose the easiest, you know, they did a live Coronation Street around the same time, didn't they, and stuff like that. Which none of it's easy, but I had, you know, you have to admire the sheer scale of it, and it's not just like doing two people sitting in a room and talking live. It's got spaceships and invaders and stuff.
Yeah,
it's big.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, an awful lot of it is about what we've lost. I mean, the pit live is breathtaking. It's breathtaking. And I mean, after 40 years, a lot of that expertise was simply lost. It was like, how did they do that? You go, oh my God, they dug down by raising the sides of the pit, and you know that I never forget discovering that rather curiously directed bit with the journalist that they're talking to Roni. I'm not sure about this, Roni. Ape men, Knightsbridge, and it goes from journalist to journalist and journalist, and finally to Cease Linder. And it's because he's run from the other studio. That moment, you know, of like, he wasn't very tall, but he walked like a man.
Yeah.
And then he pelts to the other studio. So the camera, in that moment, I mean, he, you know, it makes me feel ill to think about it. It's so scary.
But you've near enough done it from that moment in the first scene where you rush back and the camera turns to the door, and I'm like, what's happening here? And then you run in and say the chopper's ready. And then it cuts to the external shot of the apprentice at night or whatever that thing is, and you're clearly like, it goes on to get a bit too long because everyone's looking at the position. And the next shot is like, you know, outside broadcast, we've got a smoking spaceship, and then there's clearly lots of talk about people, and they're like, what's this really doing? And the next bit is you appearing in like.
That's right.
Yeah. They had to keep Mark had to keep on. They've got to keep this going.
We had individual runners, which is very
right.
Who was essentially employed to propel us because we would just not remember, or it was
going this way.
Go pushing you through doors and stuff like that. To me.
And it isn't just. I mean, how many cameras did you have on the set? Because they presumably had to be moved. There was only a finite number of cameras to move around.
I don't remember. I mean, there must have been at least a lot of Steadicam, obviously.
Yeah.
I would say, I guess, I mean, an average scene must have been about 2, the usual cutting 2, but it was mixed live, you know, like an outside broadcast would be. So, and then there were occasional little pre-filmed inserts and stuff like that to cover gaps. But God, yes, it was thrilling. And I mean, I've said this before, but it was also the moment that David told me he was going to be the Doctor, and it was, I remember sort of sitting down on the grassy verge thinking, okay, so if somebody told me when I was 8 that whilst I was making Quatermass, my friend would tell me he was about to be Doctor Who, I think I would have probably died of excitement.
Was there any tiny part of you that was just like, oh, is it not? And like, or you 100% happy with it? And this is, I'm not trying to...
Oh, you mean what? Because I wouldn't be the Doctor.
Because you must have dreamed of being Doctor Who since you were a child.
Well, yes. All... What is it the Master says? Envy is the beginning of all true greatness.
And of course, you played the Master.
Repeatedly.
Yes. I suppose in that case, you played the Doctor.
Yes.
Yes. Web of Caves stuff as well.
Yeah.
Alexander wept because he had no more worlds to conquer.
Have you ever thought of doing a Kneale for Ghost Stories for Christmas? Have you? Could you do the chopper?
Oh yes, when I interviewed Judith, I tried to. Well, track tape came about because I was asked to do a documentary on M.R. James, and I said I'd love to, but I was really busy, and they kept asking, and eventually I just said, "Oh fuck!" I said, "I'll do it as long as I can make a story as well, because there's no point in doing a documentary without another Ghost Story for Christmas." And they said yes. So that's how that happened. And actually, the packaging of that was really useful. Essentially, it was 90 minutes of M.R. James, a documentary and a story, and really that was Christmas evening on BBC Two in 2013. And
I remember that.
that's what you want, isn't it? And I've tried it with Benson. I said, well, can I do a documentary on Benson and one of his stories? But they weren't interested in. But I talked to Judith about possibly doing a documentary on Nigel Kneale and then one of his stories in the same way, because it's sort of a neat way of doing it. But it hasn't happened yet. I mean, I'd love to. I think Tomato Cane is a remarkable collection. I wish he'd written more prose, actually. I mean, the Quatermass book is terrific as well, but they're really weird, those ideas. Is it Jeremy and the Wind, that one about the scarecrow? The fact he puts a pebble in his mouth to talk, and they're really weird, and you can see all those weird Manx preoccupations sort of spilling into them, can't you? But I'd love to. I think it's the one I'd like to do is it Patter of Tiny Feet? The one about the reporter photographing the poltergeist.
Yeah.
That's really good and a very clever idea. This man invites a reporter he's got a ghost in his house, a child, and they have to set up like a camera trap, but nothing shows up, but you can hear it laughing, and it's the ending that the reporter says to the photographer at the end. He said, well, it's like any parent, isn't he? He's proud of his little one or something like, I've gone cold, look, I've gone cold. Talking, it's such a creepy idea. And he's showing off his kiddie even though it's dead. But I think he's happiest when he's dealing with big ideas and is communicating those to a new audience, or some great big new concept. I mean, if you read The Big Big Giggle, again, incredibly prescient thing, and then you can actually also understand why he decided not to go ahead with it. He agreed that they shouldn't make it because it was too dangerous, but he's just seeing ahead and going, I can see this going well. And I tell you what, I just remember what really struck me as a kid when I bought the script books for Quatermass was, he says 1953 was an overconfident year. And I love that. Coronation, Everest, he thought, let's prick this bubble. And yet 2 years later, the world of Quatermass 2, the Britain of Quatermass 2 is very different. It's become a suspicious and darker and rather more paranoid place, and I think somewhere between those two poles is Nigel Kneale. He likes to prick optimism, but he's also quietly on the side of the humans.
And this goes back to Wells, doesn't it, as well?
Yeah.
Because that's Wells to a T. Wells is able to be on the side of the humans and paint ordinary human life really accurately with a very small with a very small amount of words. But on the other hand, he's not afraid to make his science fiction depressing and frightening. And
I mean, I remember as a kid, I read The History of Mr. Polly when I was younger, and his catchphrase is "rotten, stinking hole." He hates his suburban life, and Wells obviously delights in getting the Martians to blow it all up. But ultimately, he's on our side. He's a great humanist mind. Yes. Although I also think increasingly the fact that Wells's last book was called "Mind at the End of Its Tether." I think about it a lot. There's a
lot of projection. Is that because, I suppose, is it the reason that Kneale is as a genre a writer, because the ideas that he wants to present are best presented via things that we would encapsulate with horror or sci-fi, as opposed to focusing on not the minutiae, but the more direct social issues that someone like
I think it's kind of, it's interesting, of course, that he adapted Osborne, isn't it?
Indeed. The first two.
I think it's because he was a hot writer. Maybe that's why it was a great
book. And it was first film. Well, it was a way into film. So Tony Richardson was using lots of new people to get it.
It's a good association, but he obviously had an affinity with that, which is interesting. But I think the ideas are so big that I think genre, in whatever way you sort of describe it, fits things like that. If you think of a play like Fable, the famous TV play about in which black people were actually in the place of white, that's the way to I mean, that's actually shot in a very realist way, but it's sort of a sci-fi play, isn't it? Because it's even called that to sort of to say to you, this is a what if, and I think
even the continuity announcer has to tell them it's a what if.
Yes, don't worry. But something about the size of those ideas means you sort of need something like a science fiction vehicle, I think, to cope with them, even when you're actually trying to also say it's our world. Some of my favorite little bits of his writing are all those very Manxy kind of little things. The old guy in Quatermass 2 says, I used to court a girl from Widderton Flats. And just little moments of real humanity. The Woman in Black is full of them.
Yes.
Bernard Hepton says she had a bandling, bastard child, and just real economy of character there. And it's about these, again, it's as you say, it's very Wells, isn't it? It's about these gigantic concepts, but he wants to make sure it's our world, because then it feels relatable and believable.
But there's constant, every creative that I've ever spoken to in any walk of life has the horror stories of the exec stopping it or not understanding. You said earlier, like execs deciding you don't want anthology until they do. Beyond the terror of keeping their job and keeping what level of money they have, where do those people get the idea that this is what the public want or this is what the public need, and why don't they necessarily understand where you're coming from? Because these people must love the creative arts to be in the situation, or not.
Yes, I mean you must. I mean I don't. Mustn't be too down on people, because it's not like all the past was rose-tinted and amazing, and all the present is not. Obviously, people have huge enthusiasm and love for what they do. I think it's much more particularly a genre thing. That's the problem I've had over the years. There was a point I remember having a really frustrating meeting with someone when, and this is pre-Marvel, when literally the top 20 box office was all sci-fi or superheroes. As I say, before it became literally everything. People think, well, do people really like that? And I want to say, go look at the box office now. Everything that's popular, the geeks have inherited the earth. It's not cult. If you use cult now, it has to mean small scale kitchen sink drama. You can't define what we used to call cult as cult anymore. It's not. No. It's the absolute mainstream, and yet it's still an uphill battle. I think maybe because on the small screen, it's not a genre like when I grew up in the 70s and 80s, but particularly the 70s. All children's programs were spooky. We know that, and there were just as many, or it seemed like just as many sort of John Wyndhams as there were police dramas. There were medicals and there were Z cars, but there was also the Nightmare and Children of the Stone. It was just much more of a thing, and that's just changed. It's much scarcer now. As a staple of telly, that's changed. I mean, there used to be so much sci-fi and fantasy really on telly, and then that stopped. Doctor Who genuinely brought it back as a family audience thing, and then there was a bit of a rush to catch up and do other stuff, which has kind of brought it back
for a
bit.
while.
Yeah, but it's still not like it was in the mid-70s, and therefore I think there might still be a suspicion of it, except in rare cases like A Christmas, And to be absolutely frank, Dracula didn't get the figures that Sherlock did.
No,
at least initially. I mean, on catch-up, it did very well, but initially it was a bit of a surprise that it didn't get as much. And that's because it's not for everybody. You forget that Universal had a huge hit with Dracula. It was a prestige picture for them, the way that All Quiet on the Western Front was, and Frankenstein too. And then the horror boom made it less respectable, and then it never regained that. Frankenstein particularly is is regarded as great literature and very important. Dracula less so. It's an important book, but it doesn't have a reputation for sort of classical merit.
Well, it's not as good, is it?
Well, the Dracula is much better than Frankenstein. Oh my God!
You think?
Oh, it's unfucking readable, Frankenstein. God, but it's not respectable, is it?
You should put that on the cover of
no.
the cover of a new edition. Unfucking readable, Mark Gatiss.
But that's why. But of course, that's why we like it, because it's not respectable. And it shouldn't be respectable. I think that's the best horror is always transgressive, and it's full of really strange ideas, and if it becomes cozy, then something's gone a bit awry.
What Kneale means to you, both as you as a writer and artist, but as a viewer, as a consumer of such things. Ultimately, what Nigel Kneale means to you.
Well, I mean, I'm saying this for donkey's years, but he really is. He's one of the greats, and the fact that he chose to pour his talents into television is to our great benefit. It also has cost him something of the reputation he deserves, because, of course, so much of it used to be ephemeral and has gone. It exists, certain parts of it persist in the public imagination, which is fantastic, but it never fails to interest me and amuse me that a lot of important things of the past vanish, and a lot of the most popular things remain, and an awful lot of Doctor Who companions wish they'd done one extra season rather than going off to the RSC. and a lot of people who did that silly little horror film in late 1963 are now very glad of it. But that's not just because of the popularity of them, but it's because it's good stuff, and it speaks to us on a very primal level. I think his great gift was to find a way of making, and it's a very H.G. Wells thing, the voice of the common person speak through big ideas. And the scale of some of those things, and the sheer, genuinely like visionary status of things like Sex and Soul or the Stone Tape, in its anticipation of things we would actually go, oh my God, look, he's just invented DVD, and he's invented reality TV, and he's invented, I think in the Big Giggle actually have like transistor radio, face-to-face things, which are essentially iPhones, and it just keeps going. And so I think he had a tremendous heart. It's the heart of a Manxman, and he comes from an unusual place. So he's got one foot in the ancient past and one foot right into the far future, which literally and metaphorically is an amazing space to be.
Our thanks to Mark for his time, and also to Una McCormack for her help in arranging it. Bergcast is presented by John Deere and Howard Ingham, and is edited by Emma Cooper. Thanks for listening.